There's no one book, the Sharia law. It's just how Muslims feel they should live their life to please God. And you can't force it on other people. But there's a lot of misunderstandings.
For example, marriage contracts, how you choose to eat, your dietary restrictions, how you choose to dress, whether you have a beard or not. All of these things can be interpreted within Sharia law. You know, how a couple gets divorced in the mosque, in the Muslim faith. All of these things fall in line with Sharia law, but from country to country, the application, interpretation from person to person, Sharia law is not defined in like a Bill of Rights context. It's really up to the person and how they interpret their faith and their relationship with God.
But it's also an attempt by politicians to show how anti-Muslim they are so they can show their constituents that they're fighting the good fight.
Absolutely.
It's politics.
And we will talk about the political aspect of this as we get into this. But the movement, very particularly, was started by David Yerushalmi, who is known as, his name is right up there, he's been labeled by the New York Times as the man behind the anti-Sharia movement. He's on the Southern Poverty Law Center's top 10 list of anti-Muslim hate mongers in the country.
Does everyone know who the Southern Poverty Law Center is too? That's another.
So the Southern Poverty Law Center is based in Alabama, I believe. They track hate groups and expose hate groups, and also work to defend people's civil rights and civil liberties. Great team of attorneys that are present across the country. But the Anti-Defamation League also has David Yerushalmi officially labeled as a hate monger, anti-Muslim, Islamophobe.
He's an American?
He's an American. He's an attorney and an activist based in New York. And he drafted the original, he calls it the American Laws for American Courts model legislation, which was then picked up. Now, the American Bar Association, for example, said that these initiatives that target an entire religion or stigmatize an entire religious community, such as those explicitly aimed at Sharia law, are inconsistent with some of the core principles and ideas of American jurisprudence, and they're duplicative of safeguards that are already enshrined in federal and state law. And we'll get into like the legal aspect of why this movement was so ridiculous, but this just kind of will give you a broad idea of what this Islamophobia and this concerted agenda has actually been able to do on the state level in legislatures, and what they've been what they've passed in state legislatures. So 32 states have considered some form of the anti-foreign law ban. This map is not up to date. Unfortunately, that Florida right there can be a dark orange because we passed our version of the law in 2014. And we'll talk about that in a second. Yeah, so between 2011 and 2014, the anti-Sharia movement started in 2011, and it was proposed in state legislatures as an anti-Sharia ban. The ban first passed in Oklahoma. When the ban passed in Oklahoma in the state legislature there in 2011, in 2012, CAIR Oklahoma brought a lawsuit and won. It was seen as a clear violation of constitutional protected rights, and the bill was immediately struck down by the circuit court, the 13th Circuit Court in Oklahoma. So immediately after that ban, the court struck down the law in 2012, what you saw happen is it went from being an anti-Sharia ban to an anti-foreign law ban. And there are two things that specifically happened here. A, it signaled to Muslim Americans and everyone involved in this fight, not just Muslim Americans, that this agenda was very persistent, and they were willing to move forward despite being struck down. David Yerushalmi quickly redrafted the legislation so that it targeted banning the application of foreign law in American courts. And
so he was the catalyst behind all of this.
He was and continues to be the catalyst behind all of this. So not only did the Oklahoma courts striking down the anti-Sharia bill, not only did it force it to become something more vague and innocuous, but it made it broader, right? Like it made the impacts that this potential legislation could have much broader on many more faith communities, on people of no faith, but for example, maybe used to live in China and had their marriage contract drafted in China and now live in America and want to get divorced here. What does that mean about their contract? Is their marriage contract from China no longer going to be taken into account by a judge in whatever state they now live in here because there's an anti-foreign law ban?
And a very relevant point, by the way, to today's conversation is if somebody tries to use the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in court to argue a position, that under the foreign law ban, they could say, well, this is unacceptable because it's a foreign law, quote unquote.
Yeah. So,
yes. So it attacks really the UN and UN policies. I mean, and it's the same people who are behind this are also anti-UN. You know, there's a lot that can be said about that.
So when we were, you know, obviously we were advocating for our state legislature to not support this legislation. And for 3 years we were successful. We were able to kind of, through some magic, stop and prevent this legislation from passing. Unfortunately, in 2014, we were not able to prevent it from passing, but we were able to kind of strike a compromise and edit the language a little bit so that it had less teeth and less implications. But it is very important to note that regardless of the legal implications that the actual legislation has, the perceived implications of a movement that is an anti-Sharia movement passing as a bill, like those implications are definitely still significant, whether there's actual legal implications or not. Now, the irony of all of this is the American Bar Association, which credits lawyers, which understand and apply and defend the law in courts, and the Florida Bar Association were entirely against this legislation and have been since day one, because our federal and state constitutions already prevent the courts from preferring foreign law to U.S. constitutional and state law. It does not happen. In the history of the state of Florida, not once has there been a court case where a judge decides to prefer a foreign law that inhibits on a constitutional or state law.
Or any other state.
Or any other. It's never happened.
Again, false argument.
There's no, it's you know, a solution without a problem is one thing that we used to call it. And then it was also a solution without a problem that was going to cause many potential problems, because Florida as a state, we attract a lot of international visitors. We have a $100 billion a year tourism industry in our country. We have investment from Latin America, from Europe, from Russia. We, and just in general, I mean, we're a large immigrant state. And so basically to pass something called the anti-foreign law ban and tell the world, signal to business, signal to civil society, signal to the world that whoever you are, wherever you got married, the legislature is now going to overreach and tell the judiciary how to apply your marriage contract or your wills contract, or there were a lot of very serious implications that this legislation can and may have in the future, and we are monitoring that.
Are our federal and courts striking down this legislation? I mean,
so you have to wait for the right challenge, right?
Yeah,
like
you have to bring a suit. So we haven't brought a suit in Florida yet, but I mean, in Oklahoma, the federal court did strike it down.
Yeah, and just to give you an idea of the state senator Alan Hayes that was championing this legislation for 4 years.
Yeah, he's not right on a number of different levels.
We have a lot of issues with Mr. Hayes. He said when he was asked about this legislation on camera, and you can find this video online, and a reporter asked him, you know, what are you doing here? This isn't necessary, what's going on? He said, when you were a child, did your parents have you vaccinated against different diseases? That was a preemptive gesture on their part for which I would hope you're very thankful. And this is very similar to that. Your mom and dad would not want you to get sick from one of those dreadful diseases, and I don't want any American to be in a Florida courtroom and have their constitutional rights violated by any foreign law. That's it. It's not that complicated. Wow. So he essentially like drew these parallels between Islamophobia and banning this law and like vaccinating all of Floridians. Like that's what he was saying, right? Very unfortunate. Now, in these times of frustration, especially when you're dealing with the state legislature, and Gracia, you said you deal with the state legislature, so you know what I'm talking about. There are those moments that really remind you why we do the work that we do, right? Because these moments that challenge us and force us to try to be as innovative as possible, also bring people together. And I think that that has been and will continue to be the biggest takeaway that I've had from being involved in this fight. I mean, it was historic. Like, even I work on many state legislative issues, and just the coalition of organizations that came together to oppose this, you know, xenophobic, bigoted, Islamophobic legislation, and everyone called it for what it was. Everyone called the spade a spade here, and we had the entirety of the minority party, you know, the Democrats caucused against the legislation. The Jewish caucus came out against the legislation. The Black caucus came out against the legislation. And we were able to form a phenomenal coalition of organizations that were working together day by day, which does not happen often when working on legislative issues in the state of Florida.
That's probably the biggest understatement you'll hear.
So, yeah, it doesn't happen often, and I'm so proud to say that the Anti-Defamation League and Emerge USA and NAACP, ACLU, business associations, CAIR Florida, the Florida Bar International Law Section, the Florida Bar Family Law Section, like the lawyers that know more about this law than any legislator that was proposing legislation, or anyone in any of all of us. They know this law backwards and forwards, and they would know if this law is going to hurt the way people apply their contracts, that they are legally protected into entering contracts in. You know, like, that's a constitutional right. So we had faith leaders from across the state. We had the pastor that advised the Bush family call in constantly and be like, listen, this is ridiculous. I do not support this. I do not condone this. Despite all of this, despite the constitutional challenges, you know, this agenda won. The legislation passed in 2014. And was signed by Governor Rick Scott. So, you know, on this slide, you can
we
see
beat it 3
here.
years in a row.
Who authored the bill?
Hayes? Well, see, the legislation is based off of David Yerushalmi's model legislation. And then Hayes, Senator Alan Hayes,
tweaked it for
Florida, as well as Representative Metz was involved.
Who?
Representative Metz, M-E-T-Z.
Out of
Metz. And Comby. Neil Comby.
So to give you an idea about Hayes, he took this legislation that was written by David Yerushalmi, who said the nastiest thing about Muslims, women, actually even Jews, and he's just a hateful person. Won't even acknowledge that it's coming from troubling origins. Won't even acknowledge that the original version of that law.
Well, all you have to do is put them next to each other.
Yeah. The original version of the law wanted to ban practicing Islam for 20 years. Won't even acknowledge it. And then Alan Hayes and his political club in his hometown, they were giving lectures about how Muslims are a threat to this country and Islam needs to be banned. And then Alan Hayes is walking around Tallahassee distributing anti-Muslim literature that attacks the about 400,000 Muslims that live in the state. And then he's the one that brought this bill.
And he's a state senator, right?
He's a state senator.
He's a state senator from the Villages area of Umatilla Villages. So that was the final vote in 2014. And
which fell apart, basically party lines.
Yeah, party lines. I mean, we had the Democratic caucus position on it, and there were 2 House representatives that voted for the legislation.
And for the record, we're nonpartisan. We have many friends within the Republican Party that were outraged by this. Unfortunately, that didn't translate into votes.
Yeah.
Because they're told how to vote.
And well, what I wanted to, and you know, Representative Jim Waldman said on that day that this vote passed, he said this proposal stems directly from a hatred of Muslims. It's caught on across the country, and many other state legislators have dealt with this, and I find it reprehensible. So despite the fact that it transitioned from being an anti-Sharia legislation to an anti-foreign law legislation, everyone knew exactly what was going on. Everyone knew what the senators that were supporting this legislation were trying to do. And the reason I bring all of this up is because I think, as taxpayers, our legislators that aren't really doing much else to benefit us are spending time doing this. Legislating fear.
Mean-spirited
and bigoted and xenophobic, and it's just unacceptable of leadership. I don't think, regardless of what your political leanings are, I don't think you want to know that in a climate, in a hyper-polarized climate where legislation is not passing in general, that this kind of legislation is passing. And the reason I wanted to talk about that is because it is very important to understand that in today's political climate in the state of Florida and nationally in the United States, legislation and fear that targets minority communities is a political gain for current politicians. Why does this happen? Do you think that people really care? Do you think that the 24 state senators and the 78 House legislators that voted to support this legislation, there are many of them that are very intelligent human beings and very well know what's going on, and might have a tough time at night sleeping because of this vote, but they have a political gain from this vote because organizations are advocating fear in communities. That is the climate of our current political world, and it's very important to understand that. We live in the United States. We don't live in an oligarchical country in the Middle East. We have rights that we have been granted, and it's very important to protect those rights, but it's very important to note that in today's political climate, it is a political gain to be bigoted, to target minority communities, and to target people's civil rights and civil liberties. So I just think it's disturbing that it is a reality in our state today. Unfortunately, when it comes to governance and municipal issues, state issues, there is a lot more of these similar issues. And I just spoke very briefly about the anti-Sharia bill and what happened there, but we have Terry Jones from Gainesville, Florida, who was, in the ninth anniversary of September 11th, he was burning Qurans, and we know for a fact that he got a phone call from President Obama the night before, urging him, like, for the sake of our troops overseas in the Middle East, please do not do this.
At last count, he moved to this area.
Yeah,
Riverview.
And as the American Muslim community, frankly, we could care less what he burns, but it's just not productive to a healthy debate. So as our policy, we typically just ignored him, but he just likes the attention. So our best policy is to ignore him.
And he's also listed on Southern Poverty Law Center's 10 top most anti-Muslim.
It's also safe to say there are mental health issues involved.
I think we can make that assumption. Another thing, for example, that's happening because of this Islamophobia, because of this fear that's being ignited into our communities all across the country, businesses are attacked for just aligning themselves with Muslim Americans.
Or any diverse issue.
Or any diverse issue, yeah. So, LGBT issues.
Yeah, we saw Franklin Graham with the bank.
Absolutely. So the Florida Family Association, which is really a one-man show that's also based in Tampa, Florida, there was a TLC show called All American Muslim, and it was on the TLC channel. It was basically the first ever reality TV show about a Muslim American family living in Michigan. And this Florida Family Association, because they have this very quick to respond online world of trollers, they basically petitioned Lowe's to remove their commercials that were playing during the All-American Muslim TV show. And this is an organization that's based here in Florida, in Tampa, Florida.
Because their understanding is that mainstream portrayal of American Muslims is a threat because it shows that Muslims aren't a threat.
Speaking about education, you said education was so important to your organization. Another thing that's now happening in the state of Florida is history textbooks. These anti-Muslim, xenophobic organizations are now trying to basically elect their members to school boards and remove Islam from being taught in history in high school. And this is an issue that we've dealt with in many areas throughout the state. We could talk about that for an entire day in of itself. And the state legislature is now getting involved in this, trying to give school boards more authority to pick their own books and not follow a state-mandated code. So there's definitely a huge issue there. This is an issue that's just getting started, I think, in our state. We're in year 2 of these groups targeting, if you have kids in high school, just look at their textbook. They're going to learn about Christianity. They're going to learn about the 3 main monotheistic faiths in the world, and they're going to learn about those faiths' context to history, because that is what history is about. But these groups literally want to erase Islam from history, and they think that
rewrite history.
They want to rewrite history, and you know, it's definitely an academic threat that we face here in the state right now. We have Pamela Geller, who has, you know, ran these hate ads on buses. She does this across the entire country. She is also one of the Southern Poverty Law Center's top 10 anti-Muslim.
Is that the woman that tried to do
the bus ads on the heart?
The Arizona thing, did she have a gun? Did she have the cartoon thing? Was that her? That was the woman? Oh my goodness.
And she has the right to promote her fear and hate, but again, I think it's just because you have the right to promote division and hostility doesn't mean it's not the right thing. It's the right thing to do.
And another thing, for example, going back to public education, the Hillsborough County School Board was derailed for an entire year. You all just heard Hassan speak. Hassan is one of my favorite public speakers to watch speak. He was invited to a public classroom to talk about Islam, just the way that teacher had invited someone to talk about Judaism, someone to talk about Christianity. She invited Hassan to talk about Islam. For an entire year, Hillsborough County School Board was derailed because these hate groups wanted to make sure Hassan would never be able to speak in public schools about Islam ever again. And it was, you know, it was very frustrating to be a part of that fight and to try to get the school board to ensure that they would not inhibit, you know, organizations from speaking and educating students. But again, I think it raised our awareness in our community and brought us together. So, you know, that was a good positive takeaway from that.
And the outcome was
successful.
Yes.
Yeah. So we're happy to say that the school board in the end did not give in to that big
in Hillsborough County.
In Hillsborough County. Right. April Griffin was a phenomenal support. Susan Valdez, you know, like they definitely fought the fight there, but for an entire year they couldn't focus on doing what they need to do, you know, to like serve our public school children, because every meeting was held up for hours and hours and hours because these organizations were targeting the school board because they were so upset and so threatened that someone like Hassan was talking about Islam in high schools. And it translates to our political leadership. We had the most Islamophobic congressman ever elected to Congress from Florida. His name was Congressman Alan West. We're very happy to have been a part of, and I'll wrap up very quickly, I'm sorry, I'm running out of time. But you know, like for example, Alan West was a congressman. He got elected because he ran as an Islamophobe, and he said that Islam is not a religion, but a totalitarian, theocratic political ideology, and terrorism is inherent to the faith. So obviously mischaracterizing the religion, and it's just all of this to say that this benefits people, this fear-mongering and this xenophobia and this bigotry. Really quickly, I've cited Southern Poverty Law Center a couple times right now. They have this great resource on their website as a hate map. I just wanted to draw your attention that after California, Florida has the second amount of hate groups in the country. California has 57 official hate groups. Florida has 50.
As recognized by the Southern Poverty Law Center.
As recognized by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And here's a breakdown, very brief breakdown of those 50 hate groups in the state of Florida and where they're located physically on the map. And you know, of course, I can give you these resources. You can find all of this online. And I just wanted to also draw your attention to a very great resource. If you search Center for American Progress, Fear Inc., their interactive tool, and I can send this to all of you if any of you need this, but the Center for American Progress has done a phenomenal report on uncovering that there is $57 million spent annually by these anti-Muslim groups to purposefully create this fear and this paranoia towards Muslim Americans. So it's an industry of itself, and there's a great interactive tool online for you to figure out who these people are, who these organizations are, how they're spending this $57 million to influence media and politicians and schools, and it's very disturbing to see. And so, you know, there's so much I could talk about, and there's so much that we do day to day at CAIR Florida to uphold all American civil rights and civil liberties. And if I've learned anything being in this work and advocating, within the government space, the public space for civil rights, civil liberties, human rights, is it really just starts with yourself. I know that it might be very difficult to understand what you can do or how you can get involved, but it's very important for all of us to understand our agency, especially in a state like Florida, especially in a state that is so polarized and where it is so profitable and it is so, it will propel your career to induce fear into your community, but we don't want to live in communities that are based on fear, because fear leads to mistrust, leads to discrimination, leads to hate, leads to violence, leads to paranoia, and the centuries of hard work that human beings before us have gone through to identify human rights. And I think it's also very important to say in 2015 that human rights aren't necessarily set in stone. We need to understand that human rights may be fluid. We may have not included things that needed to be protected that today we need to start protecting. So we can't just hold on to documents that might be hundreds of years old and cite them. It's okay for us to create new ideas and present new rights for humanity as we progress forward in civilization and society.
Could you try to inject a little enthusiasm the next time you present this?